Domestic violence has received increasing attention over the past decade, attention that has categorized the violence as fundamentally a form of masculine abusive behavior. Growing volumes of research contradict this limited view and suggest that domestic violence is far more complex. Domestic violence involves entire families, children, unmarried couples, same-sex relationships, and elders. Welcome to Domestic Violence, Scope and Dynamics. I'm your host, Frank A. Rincon. During this program, we will examine the tragic phenomena of domestic violence and family trauma and what you and your facility can do to help. In order to successfully complete this course, be sure to read the accompanying course materials. It contains important supplemental material. There are several schools of thought on the topic of domestic violence. The popular view sees domestic violence as a contemporary phenomenon. This phenomenon, which has manifested itself as of late, has resulted in part from ideas including increased immigration, economic unrest, disintegration of family values, women leaving the home and entering the workplace, and various other questionable factors. By conceptualizing domestic violence as a contemporary phenomenon, we are able to excuse ourselves from the potential them and remain safely amongst the us non-abusers. This kind of example also relieves us of the responsibility to be able to effect a change per se, in that the change needs to occur amongst the them. This seemingly neat division is achieved in part by the definition of domestic violence being presented to the general public through movies, such as the 1984 movie The Burning Bed, as opposed to the much older classic version of psychological abuse depicted in the 1944 movie Gaslight. Such beliefs cater to the opposable views of domestic violence and further support the us versus them mentality, with the division drawn between genders as well as socioeconomic subsets. This perception has further been supported by the organizations that run and support shelters and emergency safe housing to the victims of domestic violence. The presence of the shelter service, coupled with the historical inequities in the U.S. regarding the rights of women and children in general, have proven to be a formidable obstacle in the development of an accurate depiction of the causal aspects of domestic violence and family trauma. However, though such an accurate conceptualization of the problem and the basal precursor factors has proven difficult to come by, the shelter model has been effective in the marshaling of the majority of funding towards its services, which approximate less than 10% of those affected by domestic violence every year. Given that there are widely held beliefs that aggression is primarily the providence of the males, it is not surprising that the funding allocations are prescribed in the manner that they are, and that research on aggression by women in society and their overall rates are not well received. This can be seen in such studies as the 1990 Strauss and Stitz study and the Kandor and Jasinski study in 2001. This is due in part to the underlying beliefs of some that such a focus and or acknowledgement would defer attention and resources away from the more serious problems of battered women. This valuation overlooks all those individuals, men and women, who comprise the 90 to 93% of the population of adjudicated domestic violent cases in this country, who are receiving no support and or funded services. The exception would be those individuals who file for assistance for medical and or psychological services under victim assistance programs. What is not widely disclosed regarding these services is that these programs are funded by fees levied during the judicial process on the offending agent. Expense sums for care are then subsequently assessed through the adjudicated offender for reimbursement, who often remains the primary financial provider for the family. This then becomes an additional family burden and/or a stressor with the potential to again contribute to family difficulties. It should be noted that this program is assessed by the courts during the sentencing process and reimbursement is collected from the perpetrators. The fund still manages to remain underfunded. Now let's talk to Dr. Michael A. Fraga. Dr. Fraga is a clinical director of the Ananda Institute in Santa Rosa, California. We spoke with him and examined the depiction of abuse and how it has changed over the last 50 years.
Abuse as a definition, we talk about the definition over 50 years, parallels the socio-cultural change in roles, status of roles for men and women at the most basic level, and then within the family structure and the social structure. 50 years ago, the roles were more conservative. Men worked, women were totally relegated to the domestic realm, weren't necessarily allowed to own property, right to vote. So if we look at the expansive change that's happened in our culture over time, in a very short period of time, it's been pretty dramatic. With the development of equity in the gender relationships and the redefinition of the role, we've also taken a look at what constitutes fair and equitable treatment, if you will, human rights, civil rights. So abuse in the old structure would have been a man's right to his castle. A man is the king of the castle, the kingdom. We had laws on the books that allowed the male privilege of the use of physical force or aggression against his partner in the home to a certain limit that was acceptable. We grew up with a lot of things along the lines that what happens in the house stays in the house, and that was all pride and privilege of the man of the family. With the redefinition of children's laws, child abuse laws, with the reconceptualization of the gender role, we've now come to take a look at abuse that not only constitutes physical violence, which was the primary redefinition, but also looking at things like psychological abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse. So as the years have progressed and we've become more sophisticated in identifying the change in roles for men and women in the family, in culture, and along gender lines, the concept of abuse has leveled as well. We look at abuse in general, and anything that would constitute abuse against a human being has now become qualified in the kind of sacrosanct relationship of the family, right down to the concept of marital rape, which in older times did not exist. The idea that a partner in a marital relationship could be forced to have sex and that could be illegal, which is what constitutes marital rape, was not on the tabletop 25 years ago. Today it is, which again establishes the equity between the partners in gender within the relationship, even in marriage, that there is still choice and there's still privilege. But I think the challenges for contemporary funding of services, intervention and prevention, has to do just by the terminology of preventing new occurrences of domestic violence or family trauma. We're seeing the majority of those funds really going towards the high school years, taking a look at younger populations, adolescent populations. The funds for adults tend to go into the victim side of the house, treating people who have been abused by domestic violence, who are the victims of it. Pretty much in most of the states now that have domestic violence laws, the bulk of funding under VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women's Act, which is by and large the result of active participation by local politicians and shelter folks, is provided to about less than 10% of those people who are the victims of domestic violence. The 10% number is derived from the national law enforcement statistics of people found guilty in court. Their partners, 10% of the people found guilty's partners use shelters. The other 90% don't. So the bulk of the funding goes towards that 10% for emergency and crisis services, which is way out on this end of the spectrum, and not towards the bulk of the people who are the victims and witnesses, which is that other 90%, where there is no funding for services per se, and historically are very reluctant to participate in any kind of service unless they seek individual therapy or counseling. So one is reshaping the idea of the funding stream and where prevention and intervention is involved as opposed to crisis management. And two is the uphill battle of the kind of political, social landscape of getting away from the idea of victimness to the idea of being an active component in preventing domestic violence or preventing trauma by helping people identify it earlier on and seek services or other kinds of resources to forestall or avoid it altogether. Victim assistance resources are pretty particular community to community and locale to locale, in part based on funding, also based on advocacy groups and needs. Some communities are still in a bit of denial about the need for victim assistance or resources for domestic violence, family trauma. Others are a lot more active. We had a national initiative several years ago that put the medical community into place to have to pay more attention patients coming in through ER or being seen by physicians who present with a series of injuries. So though we're watching more, we don't necessarily, other than the kind of national domestic violence hotline kind of resources, we find that the ER staff themselves aren't necessarily familiar with the local resources. Tend to be YWCAs who are very active in, again, working with this group out here, the shelter-based people. Then we have the victims advocates, which tend to be in the district attorney's offices for cases that end up being arrested. You don't need to have an arrest to contact a victim advocate. You can contact them ahead of time. Local police departments oftentimes have a staff person who's delegated to deal with domestic violence, family trauma cases. Unfortunately, a lot of those systems are activated at the point of a call for service or an arrest. They don't always have to be that way, though. Again, if we're working on the interventive side, when we see or suspect something, it would be fair game to make a referral to the YWCA, make a referral to the local women's shelter or to the victim's advocate in the DA's office or the police department to kind of further refine what kind of resources would be available to somebody in those avenues earlier on as opposed to later when we have to make an emergency call.
Let's review to see how well you've retained what we've covered so far. The popular view sees domestic violence as what? The correct answer is contemporary phenomenon. By conceptualizing domestic violence as a contemporary phenomenon, we are able to excuse ourselves from those abusers and remain safely amongst the non-abusers. With the 1997 Macias case in Sonoma, California, which established a person's constitutional right to hold law enforcement legally accountable for failing to provide equal protection under the law, domestic violence entered the penal code and opened the doors for researchers and service providers alike to begin to gather more empirical data on this contemporary phenomenon. In the process of collecting data, it was apparent that domestic violence was not a new problem, nor is it primarily associated with one gender. By beginning to conceptualize the dilemma as a problem of all people at all levels of the social hierarchy, the doors were open to develop mechanisms of intervention that would demonstrate productive possible outcomes. The popular gauge of success was measured by increased arrest rates. The problem was that this came without any kind of follow-up accounting to document the increased cost, such as social service expenses, bankruptcies, child abuse, divorce, single parenting, academic difficulties, and relapse. Little thought was given to treatment, and what ideas did develop were based on a biased conceptualization of the problem at hand, and as such were largely ineffective in improving the problem. Contemporary research is explored in greater detail the components of what constitutes domestic violence and family trauma. In the process, researchers are realizing the larger framework of power and control that is thoroughly embedded in our social structure. This structure supports domination of the other, the use of power and influence to realize one's needs, feel secure, consolidate their position of power, wealth, status, financial security, and so on. Young men are raised to be competitive, which precludes them on some level from developing the associated ability to be vulnerable, to form strong attachments in relationships, to feel broadly and deeply across the spectrum. To do so would be to reveal one's Achilles heel. The competitive male has been joined by the competitive female to be equal. To succeed has often meant to strive to beat them at their own game. It is only in the last 20 years or so that women have come to strive for their own identity of success, different and apart from the male approach. Each gender brings their own strengths and weaknesses to the table, shaped by the larger situations and institutions around us. Government, religion, culture, etc., all of which will be necessary to affect positive, productive shifts in the way society manages the future. The problem with domestic violence is that it is not one of men versus women. It is one of power and control. The solution lies not in division and blaming, but in accepting individual responsibility and working openly to effect change, one person at a time in action and deed. Let's go back to Dr. Fraga as we explore the concept of power.
We live in a hierarchical-based kind of society and culture around the world, whether it's tribal, dictatorships, egalitarian. Somebody is always above and somebody's always less than. The conservative models where the man worked, provided, caretaked, and the woman took care of the home, maintained relationship, and child rear. When we look at the dynamics of intimate relationships and personal relationships, we see a very sophisticated dance of power and control that has to do, one, with our histories, two, with the culture that we grew up in, and several other variables. And that power and control relationship can be by agreement, explicit negotiation to some degree, or it can be very covert. And that's where we see extended behaviors and profiles of things like stalking, child abuse, drug and alcohol abuse, family trauma in general. Probably real-world examples are who manages the money, who doesn't, considerations about friendships, family association, linkage, who's the decision maker. These tend to be accepted, but on a more concrete level, they're very much about power relationships. Well, this is how I feel, but Harold gets to make the choice. Or actually, my wife is the one who pays all the bills, so I'll have to check with her. As opposed to negotiation and compromise. We have these relationships. Some are taken for granted, again, and they're not an issue, and other ones are enforced, and they're enforced through a series of techniques, threats, intimidation, coercion, so on and so forth. Those are the foundations, and they extend from the models, and our models are our parents and what's going on in the world around us contextually. Years ago, athletes and politicians were pretty pristine models for us to aspire to as children. Now our athletes run around in red Corvettes with guns under our seats, and our politicians are routinely getting arrested and not getting prosecuted, and so the models have changed. We have a less clear structure, we have different meta messages going on, we have a very clear cultural piece around power, that power comes in many forms, by position, by money, by size, and so those relationships validate the individual. Nobody wants to be powerless. We all want to be powerful. To be powerful, somebody has to be subservient, and we have the basic premise of the hierarchical. You can't be powerful over nobody. You have to be powerful over somebody. And this dance happens at a series of levels.
Let's try a review question to see how well you've retained what we've covered so far. There is no funding and support for what percentage of population of adjudicated domestic violent cases in the U.S.? A, 20 to 23%. B, 45 to 50%. C, 80 to 83%. Or D, 90 to 93%. The correct answer is D. In the U.S., 90 to 93% of the population of adjudicated domestic violence cases are receiving no support and/or funded services. Separation, estrangement, and/or divorce are telling factors in families that experience violence. Violence is a significant factor that leads to the high rates of divorce. Violence, too, often constitutes to play a role in the divorce process as couples negotiate for assets and belongings after separation. Obsessive possessiveness or morbid jealousies are other factors that contribute to domestic violence. This may also be seen in the behaviors of the partner, even in the medical setting. In many cases, there are threats to commit partner homicide and/or suicide. These, along with escalating abuse, are an important warning sign of deadly violence. These warning signs are usually present before domestic violence-related deaths occur. Other factors in domestic violence include prior police involvement, threatening or harming family pets, issuance of restraining or protective orders, escalation of violence and/or aggressive behaviors, recent loss of employment, possession of or access to weaponry, and violence outside the home. Let's return to Dr. Fraga as we explore this topic further.
Most of the family trauma and domestic violence does not end in a fatality, nor does the bulk of it involve physical aggression per se. A significant amount, if not more than the majority, is emotional, financial, situational, psychological, and a lot of those people would say they would much rather have the physical aggression because the pain is localized than the ongoing emotional, psychological, and situational abuse. That said, in those cases that have progressed to the point where we're at risk for fatality, the warning signs are, take a look at things like isolation, that the potential victim really has a very restricted flow of movement. Their contact with family is reduced, their contact with friends is reduced, their general engagement with the world around them is very limited and/or managed by the other. They're seldom out and about without their spouse. If they are out and about and they're home, coming home, if they take a little too long, it's where are they? So we see elevated levels of jealousy, suspicion, paranoia, control. One of my patients took her 3 months to get her cable installed because she couldn't find the time that the installer could be there and her husband could be home. By the same token, I have another patient whose wife chased him around with a shotgun, but he was the one who still got arrested for domestic violence. So what are we looking at? Financial control, social isolation, restriction of movement. In those cases where we have physical aggression, depression or anxiety, patients may be treated for reoccurring depression and anxiety with accompanying physical injuries. And we're talking about people who didn't necessarily have them. And when we think about these victims, we don't want to think about people who are socioeconomically challenged or minorities, because domestic violence cuts across the spectrum. We have lawyers, we have physicians, we have law enforcement folks who are very competent in their day-to-day lives. It's when we get into our intimate relationships, our emotional sides, where we're not necessarily as competent and able, and we can look good during the day and go home at night and be very much the victim in a very dysfunctional situation. So to the medical person, we're going to look at a person's presenting condition, which probably is medical, and then their presence themselves. Subdued, isolated, do they reference the significant other before they respond to things? Is the significant other responding for them? What's the energy going on between the couple or the dyad? In the more marked cases, it can be very frankly aggressive and overarching.
Here's another review question. Factors in cases of intimate partner fatalities may include A. Screening of family practice patients for violence, B. Reconcilement or remarriage of the parties, C. Completion of an anger management course by the abusing partner, D. Separation, estrangement, and/or divorce of the parties. The correct answer is D. Separation, estrangement, and/or divorce is among the factors that often precede intimate partner fatalities. As you can see, the scope and dynamics of domestic violence are far more complicated than we would have ever imagined. In the U.S., between $3 to $5 billion are spent annually on medical expenses related to domestic violence. Also, approximately $100 million is lost by business annually through lost productivity, sick leave, and absenteeism. Be vigilant in your fight to protect those who may have nowhere to turn. For Dr. Michael Fraga, I'm Frank A. Rincon. Thank you for watching.